Under the crystal chandeliers, my husband smirked at our guests. "Women line up for me. Do not forget it," he boasted, treating me like mere furniture. I did not cry or throw my wine. Instead, I smiled and replied, "Oh, I know. Amanda, Brianna, Chloe, Dana." The ballroom fell dead silent as I listed the women he thought I knew nothing about, but the real secret was that the last three names were not real women at all. I am Aurora Lawson, for years. I had perfected the art of the supportive wife smile. It was the smile I wore tonight, standing under the suffocating weight of 3,000 crystal prisms suspended from the ceiling of the grand ballroom. This was the Bright Harbor Foundation annual fundraising gala, held at the absolute pinnacle of luxury in Red Hollow. The air smelled of expensive cedar wood, roasted truffles, and the quiet desperation of local elites trying to impress my husband. Grant Mercer was holding court. He always did. As the founder of Meridian Crest Holdings, he was the golden boy of the regional investment circuit. He stood at the center of our VIP table, a custom-tailored tuxedo wrapping his broad shoulders, a glass of bourbon resting casually in his left hand. The guests hung on his every word. I stood beside him, draped in emerald silk, playing my designated role, the quiet, steady harbor to his brilliant storm. "Marriage is all about risk management," Grant was telling a circle of heavy hitters, including the mayor and a few board members. He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound designed to disarm. "You take a gamble, and sometimes you end up with a board of directors in your own home. Aurora here keeps me on a very tight leash. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee without her running a compliance check." Polite laughter rippled through the group. It was his favorite party trick. He loved painting me as the rigid, humorless anchor dragging him down, while simultaneously positioning himself as the patient, long-suffering husband who adored his difficult wife. It was a subtle, insidious form of humiliation. The narrative was always the same. I was lucky to have him, a prominent donor, a woman dripping in diamonds that caught the harsh light of the chandeliers, leaned toward me. Her eyes were warm but inherently pitying. "You must be so incredibly proud, dear, having a husband who is so fiercely sought after in this town. It takes a strong woman to handle a man with his kind of gravity." Before I could form a polite, meaningless response, Grant shifted his weight. He looked at the donor, then threw a sidelong glance at me. A lazy, arrogant smirk played on his lips. It was the smile he reserved for moments when he felt completely untouchable. "Women line up for me," Grant said, his voice dropping an octave, meant to sound like a joke, but dripping with undeniable ego. "Do not forget it." He looked right at me as he said the last four words. A clear command, a reminder of my place. I did not flinch. I did not throw the contents of my champagne flute into his perfectly groomed face. I did not storm out in a tearful rage. I am 37 years old, and my entire career is built on forensic financial compliance. I do not deal in messy emotions. I deal in hard, undeniable data. I lowered my glass to the crisp white linen of the table. The base connected with the wood underneath, making a soft but final click. I turned my head, locking my eyes entirely on his. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to dial down to a dull hum. "Oh, I know," I replied. My voice was completely flat, an anchor dropping into a turbulent sea. "Amanda, Brianna, Chloe, Dana, Elise." The laughter at our table abruptly died. The mayor stopped mid-sip. The donor with the diamonds froze. For a split second, the silence was simply the byproduct of confusion. They thought this was a bit. They thought the difficult wife was making a jealous, inappropriate joke. Grant's smirk faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. Just a twitch of his lower eyelid. I did not stop. I let the names breathe. Then I added the data. "Brianna on the 12th of October, at the Grand Continental in Chicago," I stated clearly, projecting my voice just enough so the adjacent tables could hear the cadence of my words. "Chloe on the 4th of November, Suite 400 at the Azure Resort, Dana over the Thanksgiving weekend, Billed under the corporate retreat account, the color began to drain from Grant's face, replaced by an ashen pallor that clashed violently with his expensive tan. The air in our immediate vicinity dropped 10 degrees. The tension was no longer uncomfortable. It was suffocating. At the table directly to our left, a sharp metallic clatter shattered the quiet. A woman had dropped her silver dinner fork onto her china plate. I recognized her immediately. It was the real Amanda. Her face was perfectly pale, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. That sound was the catalyst. The guests around us snapped out of their polite paralysis. Whispers ignited like dry brush catching fire. I saw the distinctive glow of smartphone screens lifting from laps. The cameras were pointing directly at me. "Aurora, what are you doing?" Grant hissed, stepping closer to me. His voice was a venomous whisper, an attempt to contain the blast radius. I held up a single, manicured hand. "I am not finished." I paused, letting the weight of my next words gather in the silence. I looked at the VIPs, then back to my husband. "The fascinating thing, Grant, is not the women," I said, my tone shifting from an accuser to an auditor presenting findings. "It is the accounting. Because the last 3 names on that list do not even exist. They are ghost profiles, synthetic identities, but you still wire money to them, every single month." The accusation hung over the table, heavy and lethal. Extramarital affairs were scandalous but survivable in this circle. Financial fraud, specifically money moving through ghost accounts while standing at a charity gala funded by the very people in the room, was career suicide, panic, raw and unfiltered, finally cracked Grant's polished veneer. But his instinct for self-preservation kicked in. He forced out a laugh, loud and painfully artificial. He reached out to touch my arm, playing the deeply concerned partner. "This is absolute, baseless slander," Grant announced, holding his hands up toward the stunned guests. His voice trembled with forced outrage. "I apologize to everyone. My wife is deeply upset and not thinking clearly. Please excuse this scene." It was his classic playbook. When cornered, label the woman unstable. Make her the crazy, medicated wife having a public breakdown. It might have worked, too. I saw a few faces soften with misplaced sympathy for him. I gently but firmly brushed his hand off my arm. I smoothed the fabric of my silk dress. I was completely composed. The contrast between his frantic damage control and my absolute stillness was stark. "I will go home," I said, loud enough for the cameras to capture every syllable. "You are right about one thing. It is getting late. But before I leave, Grant, you really should check your company email, along with the board of directors, the independent auditors, and the legal team." His chest stopped moving. He stared at me, a trapped animal realizing the cage had just locked securely around him. "I scheduled a send for 9:15, I added calmly. I turned my back on him, on the VIP table, and on the whispering crowd. The sea of evening gowns and tuxedos parted for me as I walked toward the grand exit. I did not rush. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic march against the polished marble floor. Behind me, the ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of frantic questions, ringing cell phones, and the spectacular sound of a carefully constructed empire beginning to collapse. 9 years ago, I was not the woman clad in emerald silk, systematically dismantling a marriage in front of an audience. I was 28 years old, a senior financial compliance specialist at a highly respected regional audit firm, armed with a ruthless eye for discrepancies and a naive, fatal belief in corporate meritocracy. Grant was 32, the ravenously ambitious founder of Meridian Crest Holdings. We did not meet at a cocktail party. We met across a conference table during a grueling 48-hour compliance audit of his very first major acquisition. I tore his preliminary ledgers apart. Most men in his position would have been defensive, arrogant, or dismissive. Grant was none of those things. He leaned across the polished mahogany table, looked at my heavily annotated files, and treated me like an absolute revelation. He knew precisely how to disarm my inherent skepticism. Grant was intensely generous with his focus. He possessed a terrifying, almost supernatural ability to read a room, profile the person standing in front of him, and deliver exactly what they secretly craved. For me, it was intellectual validation. "I am intimidated by you," he confessed one evening over a dinner that cost more than my weekly salary. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and sincere. Most men spend their lives terrified of a woman who is demonstrably smarter than them. I find it entirely intoxicating. He built a towering pedestal for my intellect, and like a complete fool, I climbed the steps. The first 3 or 4 years of our union were a masterclass in curated perfection. We purchased a sprawling, mid-century modern estate on the edge of the city. We hosted impeccably catered charity dinners for 50 to 100 guests. We mailed out flawlessly retouched holiday cards that captured the essence of young, wealthy bliss. But beneath that suffocatingly glossy veneer, a slow, methodical psychological erosion was already taking place. It did not announce itself with raised voices, shattered porcelain, or physical violence. It happened in increments so microscopic they were indistinguishable from normal marital friction until the damage was already permanent. It always began with sarcasm, cleverly disguised as playful banter in front of our friends, a subtle, biting jab about my obsessively analytical nature over drinks, or a patronizing, slow clap when I pointed out a logical flaw in a movie we were watching. Then came the systematic, deliberate erasure of my professional identity. Whenever I reviewed his term sheets late at night and flagged a massive, multi-million-dollar legal liability, he would roll his eyes in front of his managing partners the next morning. He would call me overly cautious, a perpetual pessimist killing the deal momentum. Yet, exactly 7 to 10 days later, he would confidently present my exact, step-by-step risk mitigation strategy to his board of directors, framing it as his own midnight epiphany. I was steadily demoted from a brilliant equal to the unpaid ghostwriter of his escalating success. Grant meticulously sculpted his public persona with the precision of a diamond cutter. He became the powerful executive, the benevolent community philanthropist, the impossibly attractive businessman who managed to have it all. And I was gently, yet forcefully, ushered into the designated role of the steadfast, supportive wife. It was utterly irrelevant that my grasp of complex corporate tax structures far eclipsed that of his 2 highest-paid vice presidents combined. In Grant's carefully authored narrative, my intellect was merely a charming, decorative accessory. It was a prop to be brought out when it made him look progressive, and swiftly silenced the moment it challenged his ultimate authority. The true insidious nature of our dynamic was legally bound in our prenuptial agreement. We signed the document exactly 6 months before the wedding ceremony. At the time, I viewed it through the detached lens of an auditor. It seemed like standard risk allocation for 2 ambitious professionals entering a high-net-worth partnership. But looking back through the bitter lens of experience, I saw it for what it truly was. It was a brilliantly constructed, invisible cage. The contract was littered with vague, highly subjective clauses regarding reputational damage and the division of assets derived from joint intellectual creation. The language was deliberately murky, if I ever chose to leave him, and he could successfully frame the divorce as a hostile act, detrimental to the Meridian Crest brand. I would walk away with a mere fraction of a % of our combined wealth. It was a loaded weapon left casually on our bedside table, a constant, unspoken threat, ensuring I never made a sudden, independent move. I had secretly packed a suitcase 4 distinct times over the last 5 years. Each time the silent resentment threatened to suffocate me. Each time the invisible weight of his massive ego became too heavy to carry. I would resolve to finally walk out the front door, but Grant was an emotional predator perfectly attuned to the slightest shift in his prey. He always sensed the exact hour the thread was about to snap. He would immediately drop the arrogance and transform back into the humble, fascinated man I met across that audit table 9 years ago. He would orchestrate impromptu weekend getaways to a secluded cabin. There would be breathless, desperate apologies, tears that looked flawlessly genuine, and solemn promises of profound, lasting change. He would ruthlessly weaponize our public image against me, reminding me of the countless employees who looked up to us, the local charities that desperately depended on our united financial front. "We are a team. Aurora," he would whisper into the darkness of our bedroom, his face buried deep in my neck. "We are the model couple of this city. We cannot let them all down because of a rough patch." And every single time, the suitcase would be quietly unpacked and shoved back into the darkest corner of my closet. But the human brain can only sustain that level of cognitive dissonance for so long before the psychological pattern becomes mathematically undeniable. My ultimate awakening was not a grand, cinematic epiphany. It was a singular, chilling observation that slowly solidified into fact. Over the years, I began to notice a specific micro-expression. It was a highly distinct, asymmetrical pull of his facial muscles, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around the outer corners of his eyes that never quite reached his irises. It was the smile he wore when he was executing a flawless lie. I saw that exact smile when he confidently assured an aggressive investor about a delayed quarterly return. I saw it when he smoothly told me a late-night strategy meeting simply ran 4 hours too long. It was the physical manifestation of his absolute belief that he was the smartest person in any room, capable of deceiving anyone without consequence. And it was that exact, identical smile he wore tonight at the gala, right before he loudly declared to a table of millionaires that women lined up for him. Standing there, watching his perfectly constructed mask begin to slip under the sheer weight of my data, I felt an incredibly strange, profound sense of peace. The gala was not the singular moment my marriage shattered into pieces. The foundation of this marriage had been ground into fine dust for years. Tonight was simply the night I decided to stop sweeping those jagged pieces under the expensive rugs. Tonight was the night I finally stopped pretending I did not see the cracks. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was sitting in my home office, conducting what should have been a thoroughly mundane compliance sweep for a new community grant. The grant was proposed by the philanthropic wing of our firm, aimed at supporting local arts education. My task was simple scan through the line items of public relations expenditures, event logistics, and external consulting fees for the third quarter to ensure everything aligned with our internal bylaws. My eyes, conditioned by a decade of forensic auditing to snag on anomalies, caught a recurring classification code labeled as Independent Vendor Services. The amounts were meticulously calibrated. They always sat safely under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger a mandatory secondary board approval process. Usually, they hovered around $4,500 or sometimes spiked to $8,200. The payees were listed with an intentional lack of detail: Amanda K., Brianna S., Chloe D. At first glance, it was unremarkable in the corporate ecosystem. We frequently contracted freelance event planners, media consultants, or regional crisis management specialists. But as I cross-referenced their corresponding W-9 tax forms and service invoices, a cold friction settled in my chest. The descriptions of the services rendered were breathtakingly vague. Terms like strategic alignment consultation and regional networking facilitation filled the brief invoice lines. There were no hourly breakdowns. There were no tangible deliverables attached. There were no official company letterheads or digital footprints of registered limited liability companies. They were just clean, flat-rate wire transfers sent into the ether. I pulled the executive travel logs. That is when the isolated data points began to link together into a highly deliberate constellation. Brianna S. received a wire transfer of $6,000 exactly 3 days after my husband returned from a commercial real estate summit in Chicago. I pulled the hotel ledger from that specific trip. The corporate account covered his primary suite, but there was a secondary room booked on the exact same floor. It was paid for with a separate, untraceable private card, yet it was flagged under the same group reservation block. Chloe D. was paid $8,000 the week of a major tech conference in Miami. Again, the dates matched perfectly, the locations matched perfectly, the external partners he was supposed to be entertaining matched perfectly. The rhythm was mechanical: a business trip, a secondary room, a vague invoice, a rapid wire transfer. My pulse remained completely steady, but my fingers grew ice cold over the keyboard. The ultimate confirmation did not come from a spreadsheet. It arrived via a highly encrypted messaging application later that evening. Mara Bell, the former executive assistant who had abruptly resigned 6 weeks prior citing severe burnout, sent me a single, unsolicited text message. "I am only saying this once because I actually respect you." The message read, "Do not look at his official schedule. It is a decoy. He has a second phone, a black one, kept in the locked lower drawer of his mahogany study desk. The real schedule is on that device." I sat perfectly still, staring at the glowing screen of my phone for 20 minutes. The primal instinct of a betrayed spouse is to storm down the hallway, shatter the desk lock, demand the hidden device, and scream until the walls shake. I felt that violent urge rise in my throat, a hot and suffocating wave. But I am an auditor. I know the cardinal, unbreakable rule of any investigation: the moment the target knows they are being watched, the evidence evaporates. If I confronted him that night, the phone would be at the bottom of the nearby river by morning. He would immediately call his crisis management team, gaslight me, and leak a tragic, sympathetic story about my deteriorating mental health to the local country club circuit. I would be branded the paranoid, aggressively jealous wife invading his privacy, and he would play the exhausted victim. I did not go to the study. I went back to my laptop. Over the next 14 days, I operated in complete, absolute silence. I did not alter my daily routine by a single minute. I made his morning espresso at exactly 6:30. I attended the obligatory Sunday brunches. I smiled genuinely at his dry, arrogant jokes. Behind the scenes, I began quietly mirroring the legally issued financial reports that I had legitimate administrative access to. I downloaded them onto an encrypted external drive. I started mapping the transactions, highlighting the technique known in forensic accounting as smurfing, the practice of breaking down large, illicit transactions into smaller, less suspicious increments to bypass automated security flags. The consulting fees were textbook smurfing. Then, on a Friday night, while he was hosting a charity scotch tasting downtown, I found the anomaly that shifted the entire paradigm. I was auditing the background checks for the vendor list, a standard protocol to ensure no conflicts of interest with the board of directors. I ran the Social Security number provided on the tax form for Dana West. The fourth name on the recurring payment list, the national database system returned a fatal error. The number belonged to a woman who had been deceased for 12 years in a completely different state. I leaned back in my chair. The ambient light of the monitor cast long, sharp shadows across my office walls. My breathing slowed to a deliberate, measured pace. This was no longer a tragic, mundane story of a wealthy man having affairs in luxury hotel rooms. You do not use a dead woman's social security number to pay for a mistress. You use it to siphon corporate funds into a black hole. He was creating synthetic identities, literal ghost profiles, to drain money from the company. More disturbingly, he was pulling funds from the charitable foundation meant to elevate his public standing. He was hiding embezzlement behind the messy, chaotic veil of infidelity. If a junior accountant or an external auditor ever found the payments, they would simply assume he was a cheating husband using company dimes to hide his tracks. Not a corporate thief orchestrating massive fraud. It was a brilliant, highly illegal misdirection, a shield of moral failing used to hide a massive criminal liability. I closed the background check portal. The betrayal of our wedding vows stung, but the insult to my intelligence, the sheer audacity of running a rudimentary fraud scheme right under my nose, was the true catalyst. I navigated to the hidden, encrypted partition of my hard drive. I right-clicked, selecting the option to create a new, secure folder. I did not name it after him. I did not name it anything emotional, dramatic, or vindictive. I typed 2 simple words, a clinical label for the sequential evidence that would eventually dismantle his entire empire. Line up. I dragged the first batch of invoices, the matching travel logs, and the stark screenshot of the deceased woman's invalid Social Security number into the folder. I was not building a case for a divorce lawyer. I was building a federal indictment. The trap was meticulously set. Now, I just had to wait for him to confidently walk right into it. Evelyn Price was the only person I trusted with the sheer magnitude of what I had uncovered. During my formative years in corporate auditing, Evelyn had been my mentor, a woman who possessed a terrifying intellect and a complete lack of sentimentality. Now retired and cultivating an award-winning rose garden in the affluent northern suburbs, she still retained the razor-sharp instincts of a federal fraud investigator who knew exactly how powerful men utilized the whistleblower-crushing playbook. I drove to her estate on a brisk Thursday morning, handing her a printed, meticulously redacted summary of the lineup file over bone china teacups. She did not offer a comforting hug or sympathetic platitudes. She merely adjusted her reading glasses and absorbed the data. "You have a spectacular mess on your hands," Evelyn stated flatly, setting the papers down on the glass patio table. "And right now, you are dangerously close to combining the messes. That is exactly how intelligent women lose these battles. They allow a shattered heart to bleed all over a balance sheet. You must compartmentalize this immediately into 3 distinct layers." She held up 3 manicured fingers, counting them off with ruthless precision. "Layer 1 is the personal infidelity. That is painful, but legally, it is common dirt. Layer 2 is the embezzlement and corporate fraud. That is your actual weapon. Layer 3 is the impending marital defamation campaign your husband will inevitably launch during the divorce proceedings to protect his empire. If you mix the emotional betrayal of the affairs with the cold, hard financial crimes, his legal team will successfully paint you as a scorned, hysterical wife. The fraud will be dismissed by the board as the paranoid delusions of a jealous partner." I drove home with a singular, icy focus. I transformed my digital workspace into a sterile, emotionless war room. I built a master timeline utilizing the exact standard investigative protocols I had learned in the field. The spreadsheet contained 5 rigid columns: the exact date of occurrence, the verified data source, the specific type of evidence, the confidence level of verification, and the potential blowback risk. I operated under a strict code of ethical and legal conduct. I did not hire sleazy private investigators to crawl through bushes and take telephoto pictures. I did not install illegal spyware on his personal network or attempt to crack his encrypted secondary phone. I did not need to resort to those tactics. Arrogance of that magnitude always leaves a perfectly legal paper trail, provided you know exactly which publicly accessible filing cabinets to open and which internal corporate bylaws to leverage. I relied exclusively on the administrative data access I legally maintained as part of the Foundation Oversight Committee, cross-referenced with public tax registries and the voluntary, secure statements from former staff members who had been collateral damage in his wake. The picture that crystallized over the next 21 days was breathtaking in its audacity. The data cleanly bisected the 5 names on his recurring payment ledger. The first 2 women, Amanda and Brianna, were genuine, living human beings. They were receiving tangible financial perks, luxury accommodations, and direct wire transfers masquerading as vague consulting retainers. That was layer 1. But the other 3 names were pure, unadulterated fiction. They were shell profiles created with fabricated credentials. I meticulously traced the routing numbers attached to their supposed bank accounts. They led directly to a subsidiary holding company registered anonymously in Delaware. By cross-referencing state incorporation records, I discovered that company was quietly co-directed by Grant and his most trusted vice president of operations. The 3 ghost women were nothing but a clever accounting vacuum, explicitly designed to siphon up the exorbitant, unsanctioned personal expenses and lifestyle upgrades of the 2 executives without ever triggering board oversight. Then came the most damning knot of all, the revelation that pushed the situation from standard corporate misconduct into federal territory. I compared the Foundation event logs with the timeline of the ghost payments. Grant was systematically utilizing the Bright Harbor Foundation tax-exempt status to host lavish, high-end networking events for his private equity contacts, writing them off as charitable donor cultivation. He would then loop those exact same inflated costs back out of the foundation as fictitious vendor service payments to the 3 shell profiles. He was robbing the community charity to fund his own private slush fund, all while standing on podiums smiling for cameras and accepting civic leadership awards. Armed with verified, undeniable proof, I needed a tactical strike commander, not a divorce lawyer. I bypassed the flashy, aggressive family law attorneys who lived for tabloid headlines and messy public settlements. Instead, I secured a highly confidential, off-the-books meeting with Noah Whitaker. Noah was a notoriously private commercial and civil litigator who operated out of a deliberately unmarked office building downtown. He possessed a deep, well-documented disdain for corporate executives who manipulated public relations machinery to bury their crimes. Noah reviewed my timeline and the supporting documentation in complete, unbroken silence for nearly 45 minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim and calculating. "The data you have compiled is absolutely bulletproof," Noah said, tapping a heavy brass pen against the folder. "But your timing is the most dangerous variable in this entire equation. If you file this today, or if you anonymously leak it to the board of directors tomorrow, Grant will immediately trigger the disparagement clause embedded in your prenuptial agreement." He leaned forward, ensuring I understood the gravity of the legal trap. "He will claim you are an unstable, vindictive spouse actively trying to sabotage his business and ruin his life's work out of petty jealousy. The resulting litigation will freeze every single asset you have for years, and he will use endless company funds to bleed you dry in a court of law. We cannot just throw this bomb in a vacuum." Noah steepled his hands. "You have to wait for him to invite you onto the stage, hand you the microphone, and give you the audience. We need the absolute right forum, a place where his counterattack looks like precisely what it is, the frantic flailing of a guilty man caught entirely in the act." I understood the assignment perfectly. I adopted a strategy of absolute freezing coldness. I would let Grant continue to believe he was the unchallenged puppet master of our lives. I would let him keep constructing his elaborate public persona, laying the bricks of his own pedestal higher and higher. The higher he climbed, the harder the inevitable, bone-shattering fall would be. I did not want a messy, private screaming match in the confines of our kitchen. I wanted a surgical, undeniable public execution of his carefully crafted false narrative. I would wait patiently for him to choose the venue, and then I would use his own blinding spotlight to illuminate the rot he had buried underneath. Grant had the survival instincts of a cornered predator. Even though I maintained a perfectly placid exterior and operated with absolute mechanical precision at home, he could inevitably smell the subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure between us. His response was not to ask me what was wrong or to initiate an honest conversation. His response was a highly calculated, preemptive strike designed to completely isolate me and control the narrative before I ever had the chance to speak. It began at a Saturday evening dinner party hosted by the country club president. I returned from the powder room just in time to catch the tail end of his conversation with 2 prominent local judges and a wealth manager. He was leaning in, his posture relaxed, but his voice adopting a tone of manufactured, gentle sorrow. "She has just been under so much stress lately," he murmured, slowly swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "The compliance work takes a terrible toll. She is getting increasingly paranoid, constantly checking my schedule, obsessing over minor, irrelevant details. I'm trying my absolute best to be patient, but her jealousy is becoming a genuine concern for her health." I stood perfectly frozen in the shadowed hallway. He was actively laying the groundwork. If I ever came forward with allegations of his financial misconduct, the community would already be thoroughly primed to view me as the hysterical, controlling wife suffering from a severe mental breakdown. He heavily reinforced this false narrative with aggressive, highly visible displays of affection. On a random Tuesday morning, an exorbitant arrangement of 5 dozen imported white orchids arrived at my office reception desk, accompanied by a handwritten card professing his undying devotion. He posted a 10-year anniversary retrospective on his professional social media accounts 3 months before our actual anniversary date, calling me his anchor and his guiding light. The comments flooded in from our peers, praising him as the ultimate devoted husband. It was a brilliant, suffocating trap. If I expressed any anger, filed for a sudden divorce, or tried to expose his embezzlement, I would look completely unhinged to the outside world. I would be branded the unstable, ungrateful woman ruining a flawlessly perfect marriage. The psychological warfare quickly bled into our corporate environment. On the first Monday of November, I logged into the internal scheduling portal and discovered my access privileges to all steering committee meetings for the Bright Harbor Foundation had been quietly revoked. When I confronted him in the glass corridor between the executive boardrooms, he offered a condescending, deeply fake smile. "It is just a temporary measure. Sweetheart," he said, speaking loudly enough for his executive assistant to hear through the open door. "The external auditors recommended we create some structural distance between family members on the charity board to avoid any perceived conflicts of interest. It is entirely for your own legal protection." It was not for my protection. It was a firewall. He was sealing off my access to the foundation data. The true depth of his panic was revealed 2 days later. An older, fiercely traditional member of the board of directors, a man who had always respected my quiet competence over the years, stopped me by the concrete pillars in the underground parking garage. He looked over his shoulder nervously before speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. He warned me that Grant had recently consulted with a boutique offshore legal firm about restructuring the ownership tiers of his primary holding company. The stated reason was tax efficiency, but the board member recognized the maneuver for what it was. Grant was actively preparing to heavily dilute our joint marital assets in the event of a sudden separation. He was preparing to hide the money before I could ever claim my legal share. That afternoon, while running a routine digital compliance sweep of the marketing department's server space, I stumbled upon a restricted folder labeled with the current year and the word crisis. Inside was a single, unpublished draft of a press release. The document outlined a joint, amicable separation between us. The carefully crafted public relations language expressed Grant's deep sadness, asked for community privacy, and explicitly noted that I would be stepping away from all corporate duties to focus entirely on my personal well-being and to undergo intense psychological treatment. He was planning to publicly declare me mentally unfit and neatly remove me from the chessboard before I could ever make a move. The sheer, breathtaking sociopathy of the drafted statement made my vision blur for a fraction of a second. I did not confront him. I did not print the document, march into his office, and throw it in his face. Instead, I drove straight to the unmarked office building downtown. Noah Whitaker reviewed the draft press release with a look of absolute disgust. He did not waste time with comforting words. He immediately drafted a series of highly aggressive, legally binding litigation hold notices. These were formal, mandatory directives sent via private courier to the Corporate Information Technology Department, the external accounting firm, and the foundation directors. The holds legally forbade the destruction, alteration, or transfer of any financial records, emails, or server data under penalty of severe federal sanctions. We filed them entirely under the radar, ensuring Grant would not be notified by the legal compliance officers until it was far too late to run the physical shredders or wipe the hard drives. I sat in Evelyn Price's sunroom the following morning, the weight of the impending collision pressing heavily on my chest. I felt like I was suffocating under the meticulously constructed narrative Grant was weaving around me. Evelyn poured a cup of black tea and looked at me with piercing, unsympathetic clarity. "You are letting his tactics intimidate you," Evelyn observed sharply, setting the silver teapot down. "You are looking at his strengths. The charm, the network, the public relations machinery. You need to look at his fatal flaw. What is the one thing your husband cannot resist?" "Winning," I replied softly. "No," she corrected instantly. "Winning in front of an audience. He is a narcissist of the highest order. He requires a crowd to validate his existence. He needs to crush you. But he needs people to watch him do it so they can applaud his incredible restraint and pity him. That is his weakness. He is deeply, fatally arrogant in a spotlight. She was entirely correct. The pieces clicked into place with satisfying, mathematical precision. The Bright Harbor Foundation had just mailed out the heavy, embossed invitations for their annual winter fundraising gala. It was the most important social and financial event of the year in Red Hollow. Grant was scheduled to be the keynote speaker, standing on the main stage to announce a massive new community investment fund. He would be surrounded by the press, the city elite, the major donors, and his entire board of directors. It was the exact venue he would want to use to finally push me over the edge. I knew he would spend the entire evening subtly baiting me, trying to force a public meltdown to justify his drafted press release. He wanted me to lose my temper, to scream, to cry, to throw a glass of wine, to prove to the entire room that I was the unstable, hysterical liability he claimed I was behind closed doors. He was building a grand, glittering stage for my execution. He had absolutely no idea I was going to use it for his. I walked into my closet that evening and bypassed the subdued, conservative gowns I usually wore to corporate functions. I selected a striking, deeply saturated emerald silk dress. I scheduled a professional hair and makeup appointment for the afternoon of the gala. I was not going to hide in the shadows, and I was certainly not going to play the role of the frail, medicated wife stepping away for her health. I was going to walk into the brightest room in the city, stand directly next to the man who was trying to bury me, and wait patiently for him to hand me the microphone. The gala unfolded almost exactly as I expected. Grant baited me in front of donors and journalists. I gave him nothing. And when he finally delivered his line about women lining up for him, I answered with names, before he could reduce it to a marital scandal. I pivoted to the real issue, the ghost profiles and the stolen foundation money. He tried the same playbook, paint me as unstable, over-medicated, irrational, but by then the files had already been delivered to the board, counsel, and the auditors. I walked out before the room finished realizing what had just happened. By 7 o'clock the next morning, my phone was vibrating so violently against the nightstand, it sounded like a drill. I did not need to guess what was happening. The modern American media machine had woken up. A tightly edited, 45-second video clip from the gala was spreading across every local social media platform like a contagion. Whoever uploaded it knew exactly what they were doing. The clip showed me calmly listing the women's names, but it abruptly cut to black precisely 1 second before I exposed the synthetic profiles and the embezzlement. To the thousands of people watching it over their morning coffee, I was not a brilliant auditor exposing corporate fraud. I was just a bitter, terrifyingly cold, jealous wife humiliating her husband in public. Grant did not waste a single hour. By noon, his high-priced public relations firm issued a polished, universally distributed press release. It was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. The statement expressed his profound, heartbreaking sorrow over my deteriorating mental state. He asked the community for privacy during this devastating personal crisis. More dangerously, the bottom half of the release subtly shifted the narrative toward legal aggression. It heavily implied that my delusions had led me to illegally access confidential corporate files, framing my actions as a reckless breach of privacy that threatened the hardworking employees of Meridian Crest Holdings. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. 3 major regional donors publicly announced they were freezing all financial commitments to the Bright Harbor Foundation until the situation stabilized. The court of public opinion violently fractured, but the loudest voices were dragging me through the mud. My face, captured in a harsh, unflattering freeze frame from the gala, was plastered across local business blogs. I have always despised the spotlight. I built my entire career operating quietly in the background, analyzing ledgers and mitigating risk. Now, I was the main character in a cheap, grotesque soap opera, completely surrounded by a narrative I could no longer control. The psychological siege quickly escalated into a tangible legal assault. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, a process server knocked aggressively on my front door. He handed me a thick stack of court documents. Grant had filed an emergency ex parte injunction against me. The legal phrasing was dense and hostile, designed to immediately paralyze me. The order temporarily barred me from stepping foot within 100 yards of the corporate headquarters, restricted me from contacting any current staff members, and formally accused me of tortious interference with business operations. He was trying to shove me into a defensive posture, forcing me to drain my personal savings on retainer fees just to fight for my right to speak. But the most crushing blow arrived 24 hours later. Brianna Hale, one of the actual women on the payroll, panicked, terrified of losing her lucrative career and facing public ruin. She hired a mid-level defense attorney and released her own vehement denial to a local newspaper. She categorically denied any inappropriate relationship with Grant and swore she had never received unearned funds. She claimed my accusations were the paranoid fantasies of a woman losing her grip on reality. Watching another woman throw herself onto Grant's sword to protect him made my stomach physically churn. Her lie gave Grant's defense a massive, concrete pillar of credibility. My entire story suddenly looked incredibly fragile. Behind closed doors, Grant was consolidating his power. Mara Bell sent me a brief, encrypted message detailing an emergency all-hands meeting held at the firm. Grant stood before his employees, looking haggard and appropriately tragic. He spun a compelling tale of a politicized marital crisis, claiming I was using the company as a weapon in a bitter, impending divorce. He rallied his troops, transforming himself into the resilient captain steering their ship through an unprovoked storm. That night, sitting on the hardwood floor of my home office, surrounded by printed legal injunctions and glowing screens filled with hateful comments, I felt a dangerous, suffocating wave of exhaustion. This is exactly how powerful men always win. They do not fight the evidence. They simply destroy the credibility of the woman presenting it. The sheer weight of the wealth, the connections, and the deeply ingrained societal reflex to call a difficult woman crazy was threatening to crush me completely. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, I considered calling Noah and telling him to drop everything. I wanted to disappear. My phone rang. It was Evelyn. She did not bother with a greeting. "You are reading the internet," Evelyn stated, her voice slicing through my spiraling panic like a scalpel. "Close your laptop immediately. Turn off the television." Brianna lied, I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. She lied to the press. "Evelyn, Grant locked me out of the servers. Everyone thinks I am insane. His public relations team is completely burying me." "Let them dig the hole," Evelyn commanded sharply. "Listen to me very carefully. You are experiencing the predictable, standard-issue backlash of striking a protected asset. You do not need the local bloggers to believe you today. You do not need the country club wives to defend your honor. Public opinion is a loud, useless distraction. You only need the documents to speak for you on trial day. The noise outside your window means absolutely nothing. Stay on the timeline." Her absolute, unwavering pragmatism was a lifeline. I took a deep, jagged breath and forcefully slammed my laptop shut. She was right. I was fighting a war of data, not a popularity contest. Less than an hour after Evelyn hung up, my phone vibrated again. This time, the caller identification displayed Noah Whitaker's secured line. "I told you the timing had to be perfect," Noah said, bypassing pleasantries entirely. The usual grim tone in his voice was replaced by a sharp, undeniable edge of satisfaction. "Grant's public relations team just spent 2 days convincing the entire city that you are crazy, but they completely forgot about the people who actually govern the money." "What happened?" I asked, pushing myself off the floor. "The independent auditing firm," Noah replied. "The one you copied on the internal server drop during the gala. They do not care about viral videos or press releases. They care about federal liability." I held my breath, waiting for the impact. "They just issued a formal, legally binding demand letter to the board of directors of Meridian Crest Holdings," Noah continued, his words falling like heavy. "Satisfying hammer strikes. They are demanding full, unrestricted access to the complete, unredacted payment ledgers, employee expense accounts, and foundation disbursement records going back exactly 5 years. If Grant refuses, they will immediately drop the firm as a client and report the anomaly to the federal regulators. A slow, cold smile spread across my face in the empty room. The media could call me crazy all they wanted. Grant could hide behind his carefully orchestrated sympathy tour, but the bomb I dropped in that ballroom had bypassed the social armor and detonated deep inside the vault. The real investigation had officially begun. The narrative abruptly fractured exactly 72 hours later. The crack did not originate from a media leak or a dramatic public confession. It started with a highly encrypted, completely unexpected phone call to Noah Whitaker, Amanda Keene, the woman who had shattered the silence of the ballroom by dropping her silver dinner fork. Bypassed me entirely. She reached out directly to my attorney, offering a massive cache of internal corporate documents in exchange for a binding non-disclosure agreement that would shield her identity from the public docket. When Noah summoned me to his unmarked downtown office to review her file, I fully expected the typical, desperate rationalizations of a cornered mistress. I was entirely wrong. Amanda was not a naive girl swept off her feet by a wealthy executive. She was a highly connected, ruthless political consultant. The romantic entanglement was merely a convenient byproduct of a much darker professional arrangement. Grant had deliberately drafted her consulting contracts with intentionally ambiguous language. He was not just paying for her companionship. He was actively using her legitimate business infrastructure as a pristine, legally defensible shield for off-book corporate expenditures. Amanda slid a thick manila envelope across Noah's conference table. Inside were unredacted email threads, itemized hotel folios, and direct text messages spanning 3 years. The documents revealed a staggering quid pro quo operation. Grant was utilizing the Bright Harbor Foundation as a deceptive front. He hosted lavish, highly exclusive dinners for municipal politicians and major private equity donors under the guise of charitable fundraising, but in the private suites booked under Amanda's name. He was negotiating aggressive, off-the-record zoning variances and lucrative public contracts for Meridian Crest Holdings. He was directly converting tax-exempt charity funds into raw political leverage. The domino effect accelerated rapidly. Less than 48 hours after Amanda secured her immunity deal, Brianna Hale's heavily publicized defense completely collapsed. Grant, operating purely on survival instinct, recognized that Brianna had become a massive liability after she spoke to the press. He immediately severed all communication with her and instructed corporate human resources to permanently terminate her vendor contract. Abandoned, terrified, and suddenly staring down the barrel of a federal fraud accessory charge, Brianna broke. She returned to the same local newspaper. But this time, she was accompanied by a white-collar defense attorney. Brianna confessed that she had never actually provided a single hour of media consultation for the firm. Grant had forced her to sign inflated retainer agreements for public relations fees. Her instructions were explicit and brutal. She was allowed to keep exactly 15% of the total wire transfer as a silence fee. She was then mandated to route the remaining 85% directly into a subsidiary logistics company when I ran the incorporation records for that specific subsidiary. The managing director was not a stranger. It was Grant's hand-picked vice president of operations. I sat at Evelyn Price's dining table, completely surrounded by towering stacks of financial ledgers, tax returns, and sworn affidavits, together. We finally assembled the massive, terrifying mosaic of his operation. The methodology was brilliant in its sheer complexity. Grant had engineered a hybrid embezzlement machine. He used real women like Amanda to facilitate high-level bribery. He used compromised vendors like Brianna as human pass-through accounts. And he used the 3 synthetic ghost profiles to quietly vacuum up the remaining capital for absolute personal enrichment. The most devastating realization had nothing to do with my ruined marriage. The money flowing through this corrupt ecosystem was not just corporate profit. A significant portion of the stolen funds was directly traced back to the community grant allocations of the Bright Harbor Foundation. He was stealing money explicitly designated for underprivileged school districts and local health initiatives to finance his illicit political maneuvering and his luxury hotel suites. This was no longer a scandalous divorce proceeding or a battle over reputational damage. It was massive, systemic, federal wire fraud. The urge to completely destroy him was a living, breathing thing inside my chest. The local bloggers were still gleefully dissecting my mental health. The country club wives were still sending me condescending, pitiful text messages. I had the absolute power to digitize the entire Amanda and Brianna dossiers, leak them to every major financial news outlet on the eastern seaboard, and watch his public image burn to ash in a matter of minutes. But I refused. I looked at the files and aggressively shoved the temptation down. I strictly maintained my core principle. I would not litigate this case in the chaotic, completely lawless arena of social media. I would not trade my professional integrity for a cheap, fleeting moment of internet vindication. He would face his execution in a court of law, buried under an avalanche of undeniable, heavily audited paperwork. The pressure finally breached the boardroom walls. Armed with the initial demand letter from the independent auditors, the Meridian Crest Board of Directors convened an emergency, closed-door session. Recognizing the existential threat of federal regulatory intervention, they officially voted to strip Grant of his unilateral signing authority. His access to the corporate treasury was completely frozen pending a full forensic review. Grant did not surrender. A wounded narcissist simply changes the target. Through his crisis management team, he immediately launched a vicious counteroffensive. He drafted internal memos throwing his vice president of operations entirely under the bus, claiming he had been completely blind to a rogue embezzlement ring operating within his own ranks. More predictably, he began planting aggressive rumors that I was the actual mastermind. He insinuated that my background in financial compliance gave me the perfect skill set to manipulate the accounting software, digitally fabricate the invoices, and perfectly frame him during a bitter marital dispute. I was bracing for the next wave of public attacks when Noah called me late on a Friday afternoon. His voice lacked its usual sharp confidence. It was tight, cautious, and incredibly flat. "The court just reviewed his emergency civil filings," Noah said, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the receiver. "The judge is refusing to rule on the asset freezes or the injunctions today. Instead, they just issued a mandatory order. We have to attend a binding but closed-door mediation session next Thursday morning." I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning completely white. "Mediation. You cannot mediate federal wire fraud." "He is not mediating the fraud," Noah replied darkly. "He is using the family court system to force us into a sealed room before the federal authorities can officially subpoena the foundation records. He has absolutely no intention of negotiating a fair settlement. He is building another trap." The mediation took place on a bleak Thursday morning inside the neutral, sterile conference room of a retired appellate judge. The air conditioning hummed, a low and mechanical drone that barely masked the hostility radiating across the polished mahogany table. Grant walked in exactly 7 minutes late. It was a classic, calculated power play. He wore a bespoke navy suit, exuding the relaxed, untouchable confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. His high-priced divorce litigator trailed behind him, carrying a single, heavy leather briefcase. Grant slid a thick, bound document across the center of the table. He did not look at my attorney. He looked directly at me, his eyes brimming with a sickening mixture of pity and condescension. "I am offering you an incredibly generous exit," Grant said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of guilt. "A settlement of $12 million, the house in Red Hollow, the investment portfolios, everything you need to live a very quiet, very comfortable life. All I require in return is your signature on a lifetime non-disclosure agreement and a formal, written retraction of all your baseless complaints to the Foundation Board and the independent auditors." He leaned back, intertwining his fingers. "Let us be honest with everyone in this room. You are deeply hurt by my personal indiscretions. I understand that. But you are allowing your broken heart to orchestrate a vindictive crusade that will inevitably destroy the company we both built. Take the money, walk away before you embarrass yourself any further. Noah had given me one strict instruction before we entered the building: remain absolutely silent until he gave the signal. I obeyed. I sat like a statue carved from ice, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring blankly at the polished wood. Grant took my silence for submission. He saw a woman who had finally been crushed under the sheer weight of his public relations machinery and legal threats. He thought I was simply gathering the courage to surrender. That is when he decided to deliver what he believed was the fatal blow. Since your client refuses to be reasonable, let us address her so-called compliance expertise, Grant said, nodding to his litigator. The lawyer unclasped the briefcase and produced a stack of color photocopies, sliding them toward Noah. These are the internal authorization memos for the vendor disbursements you are desperately trying to frame as fraudulent, Grant continued, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Take a very close look at the bottom of each page. I shifted my gaze to the documents. There, printed clearly at the bottom of the invoices authorizing payments to the synthetic ghost profiles, was my digital signature stamp. It was a masterstroke of malice. If this evidence held up, it completely obliterated my position. It would not just cost me the divorce settlement. It meant I had actively approved the embezzlement. I would be dragged down as his co-conspirator, facing severe civil liability, total professional ruin, and potential federal prison time. He was betting my entire freedom on my willingness to back down out of pure terror. Grant leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You signed off on every single transaction. Sweetheart, if you burn me, you burn yourself. I did not gasp. I did not recoil. I slowly picked up the first photocopy, examining the ink, the margins, and the pixelation of the stamp. I looked at Noah. Noah gave a microscopic nod. I finally broke my silence. My voice was utterly flat and devoid of emotion. This is a truly fascinating piece of fiction, I stated, dropping the paper back onto the table. You always were terrible at software integration. Grant frowned, his triumphant smirk faltering. What are you talking about? The digital authorization stamp used on these documents is version 4.2 of our internal compliance software, I explained, leaning in just enough to invade his space. Meridian Crest Holdings transitioned to version 5.0, which integrates mandatory biometric two-factor authentication, exactly 24 months ago. I know this because I personally authored the compliance protocol for the system migration. The dates on these memos are from the last 8 months. It is impossible for this specific signature file to exist on a document generated this year. The retired judge, serving as our mediator, adjusted his glasses, suddenly leaning over to inspect the papers. Only the former systems administrator would know the exact pixelation difference, I continued, holding Grant's horrified gaze. But whoever forged this simply dug into an old archive, extracted an expired signature file, and pasted it onto a newly fabricated invoice, before Grant's lawyer could object. Noah stood up and opened the heavy oak door to the hallway. A man in a simple gray suit stepped inside, carrying a sleek silver laptop. This is Mr. Vance, an independent digital forensics expert, Noah announced, his voice ringing with the lethal authority of a trap snapping shut. He has already reviewed the raw server data acquired under our litigation hold. The metadata on these specific files proves they were created, altered, and backdated exactly 4 days ago. Furthermore, they were generated directly from the IP address registered to your private home office. Grant, long after the federal preservation orders were in place, the temperature in the room plummeted. Grant's litigator turned the color of ash. He immediately pushed his chair back, physically distancing himself from the forged documents on the table. No attorney with a functioning brain will willingly sit next to a client who just suborned perjury and submitted fabricated evidence in a formal legal proceeding. I cannot represent these documents, the lawyer stammered, frantically shoving his files back into his briefcase. Grant sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. the realization of his catastrophic miscalculation washing over him. He thought I came to the mediation to beg for a settlement. He did not realize I came to lock the final door on his remaining escape route. By submitting the forged documents, he had just handed us documented, undeniable proof of evidence tampering. The mediator immediately suspended the session, declaring the environment fundamentally compromised by criminal fraud. We walked out of the conference room, leaving Grant sitting alone in the suffocating silence of his own making. As we stepped into the bright sunlight of the parking lot, my phone vibrated in my purse. It was a secured, anonymous message from the older board member who had warned me weeks prior. I read the text, my blood turning to ice. I handed the screen to Noah. The message was brief and terrifying. He knows he is trapped. He just authorized an emergency wire transfer. He is liquidating the remaining operational capital and moving it to an irrevocable trust in South Dakota. The transfer is scheduled to clear the banking system at exactly midnight. Grant was going to burn the entire company to the ground and steal the ashes in the middle of the night. Noah did not hesitate. He tossed his briefcase into the trunk of his car. "Get in. We are not going home. We are going directly to the county courthouse." The intellectual chess match in the shadows was officially over. We were racing straight toward the final, brutal collision, where everything had to be frozen, exposed, and destroyed under the unforgiving light of the law. The emergency hearing at the Hawthorne County District Court convened with the frantic, suffocating energy of a sinking ship. The air in the courtroom was heavy, smelling of polished wood and nervous sweat. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Members of the board of directors, representatives from the foundation, independent auditors, and a small army of corporate litigators filled the heavy oak benches. We were all there because of the midnight wire transfer attempt. The judge, a notoriously strict woman with zero tolerance for white-collar maneuvering, called the session to order exactly at 9 a.m. Grant walked through the heavy double doors wearing his signature tailored navy suit. Remarkably, he still carried a faint, residual aura of arrogance. He flashed a practiced, tragic smile toward the board members in the gallery, fully believing that his charisma and deep-rooted network could still blur the lines of truth. He genuinely thought he could charm a county judge the exact same way he charmed country club investors over expensive dinners. He reached out to shake the hand of the foundation chairman, but the older man simply turned his back, leaving Grant grasping at empty air. Noah Whitaker did not give my husband the chance to speak or spin a narrative. Noah stood up and methodically dismantled Grant's entire existence in front of the silent room. He did not yell. He simply placed the exhibits on the podium. He traced the undeniable, heavily audited flow of capital. He presented the verified payments to the actual women, then seamlessly transitioned to the ghost profiles. He showed the court the routing numbers leading directly to the shell company controlled by Grant and his vice president. He submitted the digital forensics report from our failed mediation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Grant had fabricated the metadata on my digital signatures to frame me for his crimes. Noah explicitly noted that the midnight wire transfer was a desperate, illegal attempt to move $10 million out of the legal jurisdiction before the sun came up. But the absolute, fatal blow did not come from a spreadsheet or a forensic data log. It came from the witness stand. Mara Bell, the former executive assistant, walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. She raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was devastatingly clear and entirely unshakable. She detailed Grant's direct orders to maintain the secondary, hidden device. She explained how he forced her to scrub his official calendar and manually label the fraudulent corporate wire transfers with female names. She looked directly at the judge and stated that Grant explicitly told her it was a brilliant contingency plan if the payments were ever discovered by the accounting department. Human resources would simply assume it was hush money for a string of messy affairs, shielding him from a full financial audit. He used the pathetic cliché of a cheating husband as a bulletproof vest against federal embezzlement charges. Following Mara, the sworn, legally binding affidavits from Amanda and Brianna were entered into the official public record. They corroborated every single detail. They confirmed the hybrid model of real affairs and fabricated consulting fees, cementing the intentional financial concealment model. The judge did not deliberate for long. She looked down at Grant from her bench with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. She immediately granted our emergency petition. She slammed her wooden gavel down, issuing a comprehensive, immediate freezing order on all of Grant's personal and corporate assets. She appointed a temporary, independent receiver to seize total control of the disputed properties and investment accounts. The Meridian Crest Board of Directors did not even wait to leave the building. They huddled together in the back corner of the courtroom gallery and officially voted to terminate Grant from his position as Chief Executive Officer, stripping him of all executive powers effectively immediately. I did not jump out of my chair. I did not scream in triumph or gloat. My victory was not about seizing his wealth in a chaotic fit of rage. I had secured exactly what I set out to protect: my professional dignity, my clean name, and the legal right to a transparent, equitable division of assets. The false narrative of the unstable, medicated wife was permanently dead, buried under a mountain of undeniable legal precedent. As I walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind me, I heard rapid footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floor of the corridor. Grant caught up to me, aggressively grabbing my elbow to spin me around. He looked completely unraveled. His expensive tie was loose, his hair was messy, and his eyes were wild with the sudden, terrifying realization that his empire was entirely gone. "You destroyed my entire life, Aurora," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fury and disbelief. "You burned down everything we built over a few women. Are you happy now?" I smoothly pulled my arm out of his grasp. I looked at the man I had married 9 years ago, the man who had tried to convince the world I was insane, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no sorrow, and certainly no pity. There was just the cold, clean clarity of an auditor who had successfully balanced the ledger. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, echoing slightly in the empty hallway. "I ended you the day you thought you could turn women into accounting covers." I turned my back and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking a steady, unbroken rhythm on the floor. I left him standing there alone in the corridor, completely stripped of his audience and his power. I did not celebrate loudly. I did not throw a lavish party. I simply drove back to my house, locked the doors, and slept for 12 solid hours. A few months later, I signed the commercial lease on a modest, beautifully lit office space downtown. I mounted a brushed steel plaque next to the front door that read Lawson Integrity Group. It was an independent risk consulting firm. My first clients were small, local businesses and community charity funds, the exact types of vulnerable organizations that Grant had preyed upon. I used my extensive expertise to help them build robust, foolproof anti-fraud systems. I took the most humiliating, public ordeal of my life and transformed it into a weapon of undeniable public competence. I no longer need to prove to anyone that I'm worthy of being chosen. I do not need a powerful, arrogant man to validate my intellect or my worth. I only need to know that I will never again allow my name, or my sanity, to be used to balance someone else's corrupt books, for the first time in nearly a decade. My silence is a deliberate choice, not a terrified submission. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so more people can find this story.